Hi everyone, it's Reva with Quality Sewing and Vacuum. I'm so happy to be here. And today we're going to talk about something very simple and basic. However, it's something we all need to know. And that's getting the right seam and having a good seam. So let's talk a little bit about why you want a good seam. Now, if you have the proper seam stitched, the right seam allowance and all those things, and it's nice and straight, then you're going to have a better finished product. Okay? So in college, one of my instructors said the more precise you cut your pattern out and the more precise you sew your seams, the better the fit. And that's very true with garments, but it's also extremely important when you're working with quilts. So if you look at the one behind me, you can see all the little different shapes and everything. And imagine if your seam allowance was off on that, then it becomes a bigger issue because then nothing's going to fit together because everything is compacted into a small space. So therefore, it has to be better, right? So let's talk a little bit about things we can do to get a good seam. So we're going to go over to the machine now, and let's take a look at just doing a general seam. So if I wanted to do a seam allowance, now seam allowances differ, and a lot of times it's marked right on the bed of your machine. A 5/8 inch seam allowance is what you standardly will see in the sewing industry for garments, and then a 1/4 inch is for quilting. Then you'll also see 3/8 on some other garment patterns, and even a 1/2 inch, which is more of a home deck or a different project like that. So when you're sewing, I'm going to stick it on here on a 5/8. When you're sewing and you're doing your seam, it is good. My machine wants me to put my dual feed down. Thank you for reminding me. You want to stay as far, on that line as much as possible. Now, when you're sewing a seam, traditionally the bulk of your fabric is to the left of the needle because we don't have a huge amount to the right, enough for a whole garment in here. In this machine, you pretty much do, but it's still better to be to the left of that. So then when you're sewing, you notice my 5/8 inch seam is out here. My mark is out in front of the needle. It is best to look in front of you where you're going as opposed to concentrating on the needle. Now, when you go to stitch your seam and you need to reorganize the fabric because you have a lot, you're doing curtains or you're doing a tote bag or something like that, and you need to readjust your fabric, if you have your needle up, which is what I have now, it's easy to get off of your line. So it's best, I find, to sew with my needle down. That way, if I need to stop and organize my fabric, my fabric isn't going to go anywhere off of the seam, so you won't get the jiggy jaggies that you get on your seam allowance. Now, if you're sewing and you start going crooked, it's okay, just kind of work your way back. Okay, so that's just some basic stuff. Now, if you are just getting acquainted with sewing and you want to practice your straight lines, then by all means do something like a pillowcase or something like that that is just full of straight stitching to make life really easy for you. And we're going to talk about some other ways that we can do straight stitches here and seam allowances in a little bit. But let's say you're doing a garment and you have a curved seam. This is an inside curve. So I'm going to put the fabric in so the curve is parallel with the edge of my foot, not on the edge of my foot because my 5/8 inch is out to the side. And I'm going to sew, and then I'm going to watch my seam marker, my 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to kind of manipulate the fabric. Now, if you get to a point where you can't manipulate, stop with the needle down and adjust just slightly. Just give it a little bit of a little adjustment, and you can do that every once in a while, and then you're going to be able to maintain going around that curve. See how easy that is? And we're going to be able to get a nice smooth curve. Okay, so I'm just about finished with this guy. Now, when you're doing this on a neckline or any type of curve like this, it is somewhat unbiased, so be cautious on how much you manhandle or manipulate the fabric because you don't want to stretch out and change the shape of your curve. Now, just one more thing, when you have a curve like this, I've stitched the right sides together, so I need to turn it the opposite way, right? And that means all this fabric needs to squish into a tighter space. So it's going to be better or best for you to go ahead and clip your seam allowance. Now, I'm clipping perpendicular to the stitch line, and I'm not cutting the stitches, I'm cutting up to the stitch line. And this will give the fabric some movement so it can stretch and compress where needed. So let's just get that, and then you're going to see that when we turn it right side out, it's going to make a much better seam because everything is able to stretch and grow with the change in the seam allowance. Now let's take a peek underneath and you're going to see what I'm talking about. Well, maybe, because when we bend this way, see how it all stretches apart, so it needs that spacing. Okay, the other thing that you're going to do on something like this is we want to grade our seams. Now, grading the seams means, one, we're going to make the seam allowance a little bit shorter because it doesn't need to be that long. And we don't want it to be bulky inside a garment or another item, because with 2 layers of fabric ending at the exact same spot, it can be lumpy. So then you're going to go back in between your layers, and the one that is closest to the front fabric, you want to cut that half again shorter than you did the whole piece. Can you see there? I have the whole piece here, I trimmed down, and then there is my shorter piece. Now, full disclosure, it is easier to grade your seams before you clip or notch. Okay, so you clip when you need it to go the opposite way, and you're going to notch on an outer curve, which is what we have here. So let's look at the 5/8 inch here. I have it lined up with that, and this one is easier to do because you can anchor yourself. So when this goes around the curve, instead of having to keep moving it around, if you anchor a finger, it will just sew right around, and then every once in a while stop and reposition your fabric a little bit, and then you can keep going. So if you just anchor your fingers, it's naturally going to take it around that curve. Okay, so now accuracy is key on your seaming, because then everything gets it will be more accurate in the end. Okay, so now this one is different. So we have an outer curve here, and it needs to go into the inside. So let's flip that, and I'll show you what it needs to do. So it's going to flip in this way. So that means we have extra bulk in our seam allowance. Now go ahead and grade that, but then you can clip. But when you clip and you have a curve like this, then when you turn it the other way, they're going to overlap and it's going to be bulky. So a lot of times what you will do, it's called notching, and you will actually take out extra fabric when it comes to a curve like this. So you're just going to work your way around and, position a trash can right there so you can catch all your bits and pieces, but you get the idea. So now when you turn this right side out, and of course you're going to press, but then it's going to be really nice and smooth. Okay, easy peasy. All right, so now let's take a look at other ways that you can get the right seam allowance. Now I mentioned that you have your markings right here on your machine. A lot of machines will have the markings, but they may not say what they are. And that's when you get out your ruler and you can say, okay, from my needle, this is so far away from my needle, that line. And the easiest way to do that without putting a ruler up there is to put a piece of paper right along a line, put your foot down and put your, threading my needle, put your needle down and then put it up, and then you can measure how far that dot is from your, the dot from the edge of your fabric. And then you know what your dots are at. Okay, the other way that I like to do with my little piece of paper here is that if I know I want to have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I can take the ruler and I'm going to align the ruler with the 1/2 inch, and I'm going to make a mark on my fabric here. And then what I want to do is lower my needle down. I'm sorry, I'm probably blocking that with my hand, with my arm. Put this down a little bit so I can see. And then just put your needle into that mark and then find out where that is on the side. Now, if you need to mark that side and you want to remember where you need to align it, there's this little tape right here. It's called glow tape, and you can take that then and position it right along that spot, and then give it a trim, and then you know that when you're sewing, you can align your fabric all the way down here, and you have the right seam allowance if you stay to the edge of that tape. Okay, so that's one way. Now, this tape is a 1/4 inch wide, so if I want to put my needle down and I put my foot up, I can always run that right along the edge of my foot, of the needle, and I can feel right where that needs to go and just give it nice and straight. But if you're doing that, make sure you do trim it so it's not going to get in the feed dogs. So then you can just use your tape that way. So that's another way that you can figure out your seam, where your seams go. Another one that's really handy is to get a magnetic seam guide. So with that, you can choose where you want your seam to be, and you can position it, and then you have a little fence that you can run the edge of your fabric up against. And that's really convenient. Even if you've been sewing for a really long time, it's really a handy thing to have a guide for your seaming. Another one that's really nice to use is the seam tape here. This one has a red line, which is center needle position, and then the 1/4 inches on either side. So I would just line this up with my center needle position. Where's my 0? Right there, mark that up. And then you can just run this down the front of your machine, and now you have your 1/4 inch marked right on there. Now let's talk about 1/4 inch. I'm going to take this tape off because I want to show you some cool things here. Excuse me. Let me put this fabric in because I want you to be able to see what I'm showing you. Okay, on this machine, there is also another feature that will help you see exactly where you're sewing, and that is the projection. Now, the Viking and the Epic, Viking Epic 3 and then the Icon 2 does have the projected guidelines, and so does Brother and Baby Lock has a version that has the projected guidelines. So this is really awesome. Right now I have it set at center needle position, but if I want to move it over, I can move it over so that I have it at a 1/4 inch or at a 1/2 inch or whatever I want it to be. Let's get it. There we go. So then if I'm doing a quilt, I can set it at my 1/4 inch, and then I can just run this along the edge, and you don't have to worry about any tape or anything like that. Other thing that you can do to make sure you get the right seam is a seam gauge. So this is another way, kind of like just working with the ruler. I'm going to put my needle down, and then let me put my foot up, and I can set this against the edge of the needle, and I can see right where my 5/8 is, or my 1/4 inch, or my 3/8 or my 1/2. So you have that as an option. Another thing that is great for feet, or that I should say that is great, are accessory feet. So let's talk about basic seaming to start with. This is happens to be a 5/8 inch seam foot, and this is for this machine, but it has a guide on the side, so when you run your fabric along the side, it holds it right in place, and you're going to have that perfect 5/8 inch seam allowance. There's also one with an adjustable guide, so that way you can choose what you want your seam allowance to be at, and then it will run along the side there. Now, the most common one that we choose, let me put this up here, you might be able to see a little bit better. The most common one that we have, that we use, is a 1/4 inch foot. And we're going to talk about making a perfect 1/4 inch. But you can have a standard 1/4 inch foot, one with a center guide for stitch in the ditch, and one with a right guide for running along the edge of your fabric. So let's talk about our standard one really quickly here. And they come in clear and they come in metal as well. So with the a 1/4 inch foot, this is for a FOF, and this one is for a brother baby lock. Okay, standard feet, and they all have a nice little hole for center needle position, and this little hole gives a good support around the needle, so it makes a very nice stitch, and they have markings on them. So I'm going to show you using the FOF. The brother baby lock is similar, but this one has a color, so it might be easier to see. So it has one mark that's in line with the needle. Then it has one that's in a 1/4 inch ahead. There's one a 1/4 inch behind, and then the edge of the foot right here is a 1/4 inch from the needle. The inside of the toe right here is 1/8 of an inch from the needle. Okay, so if you run your fabric on the outside of the edge here with a center needle position, it's going to give you a 1/4 inch. Now real quick, I want to flip over to the machine here on my left. This is a brother machine. Brother and baby lock have a feature like this, and I want to just quickly show you that there are quilting stitches and piecing stitches. So this one says piecing, and if I touch that, it's going to change the stitch length to what you should have, and then it's going to work beautifully with a 1/4 inch foot. If I don't have my 1/4 inch foot handy, I can touch the one that moves the stitch over to the right, and now it's a 1/4 inch from the actual foot of the machine. So that's really a handy thing there as well. Okay, so back over here on this machine, I want to talk to you a little bit about a 1/4 inch seam. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam really fast, and let me rethread my machine, and we will get that done. Okay, so when you're doing a 1/4 inch seam, because remember on the quilt you have so many little pieces that are going together that it's not so much about the seam allowance you take, but it's how much that's left. Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. So on here we have my 1/4 inch seam. Okay, and I can measure this, and from the edge of my fabric to my seam, it's probably a 1/4 inch. Now you may have heard of a scant 1/4 inch. That means that your seam allowance is a little bit less than a 1/4 inch. Why is that even a thing? Why do you even need it or want it? It's because if my finished block, my sashing piece here needs to finish at 2.5 inches, right? And it's 2 seams, there's a seam on each side. That means you have a 1/4 inch seam here and a 1/4 inch seam here, which means there's 2 inches left right here. You follow me? Okay, 2.5, a 1/4 and a 1/4 is a half, so that leaves 2. Okay, so when I open this up, if I've taken an exact 1/4 inch here, when this gets opened up and the fabric turns up and over the seam allowance, see how that's up and over? That's called the turn of the cloth, and that takes a little bit of a micron, depending on how thick your fabric is, a little bit of the space out of your finished 2 inch spot. So if you have maybe, let's say, a 1/16 of an inch coming off here, because this was a 1/4 inch, and you turn it, so now it's a 1/4 inch plus a 1/16. I'm not doing the math, you can do it. And then I do the same thing on this side, and I get another 1/16. That's 1/8 of an inch too small, right? Does that make sense? So then your cute little pinwheels over here, pinwheels, not going to work, right? They're not going to fit together because everything's too small, and they won't end up fitting with the other blocks. So when you're working with this, take some of your scraps of fabric, do a 1/4 inch seam, and then press it open and see, does this piece here, since I have a 2 inch finished, this one thing from my seam here to the edge of the fabric without the other piece on it should be 2 1/4 left. okay? And then that way when I get the next piece on and I stitch it, I should have 2 inches finished here. So practice, test it out and see where you need to place your fabric so you're getting a proper seam allowance. Again, the 1/4 inch is a guide. Your more important is how much fabric you have left. And once you get this figured out on your machine, just write yourself a note. It's probably going to be pretty consistent if you're doing a quilt and you're working with quilt cotton. You're probably not going to have to retest every single time. But if you do this the initial time, you're going to get more accurate seams. And again, when you're working with a shirt that has ease and everything in it, it's not as important to be as precise as it is for quilting. Okay, so make sure you end up with the right size, and it may or may not be a 1/4 inch exactly in your seam allowance, but consistency is also the key. So do or do not. There is no try, and may the 4th be with you.